Change occurs, and examples of this are all around us. The coffee in your cup grows cooler, a leaf on the tree outside your window falls to the ground, a puddle grows larger as the rain continues, and you sweat a fly and it dies. These examples illustrate four kinds of change: qualitative change, the coffee cooling down; change with respect to location, the leaf falls from the tree; quantitative change, the puddle increases in size; and substantial change, a living thing gives way to dead matter. This fact that changes of these sorts occur is evident from our sensory experience of the world outside our minds. But suppose our senses are deceiving us. Suppose your entire life has been one long dream or hallucination of the sort that Descartes described in his meditations. Still, there would be no doubt, even in this far fetched scenario, that change occurs. We have one experience, then another. You consider whether you are dreaming or hallucinating, then dismiss the idea as too silly to bother with. That is a kind of change itself, change with respect to your thoughts and experiences. Yet, might change itself be a kind of illusion? The Greek philosopher Parmenides argued that when we carefully analyze what change of any sort would have to involve, we will see that it is impossible. Consider once again your coffee, which starts out hot and after sitting on the desk for a while grows cold. You might say that the coldness of the coffee, which does not exist while the coffee is hot, comes into existence. But now we have a problem, says Parmenides. For if the coldness of the coffee was initially non existent, then at that point it was nothing. When it later came into existence, it is then something. But something cannot come from nothing. So the coldness of the coffee cannot come into existence, and thus the coffee cannot grow cold. Something similar could be said for any case of change. All of them would have to involve something coming from nothing, which is impossible. Hence, Parmenides concludes change cannot ever really occur. For Parmenides, there were two choices: either one, being comes from being, or two, being comes from non being. If the first option was correct, then the same thing existed before and after, and no change truly occurred. Whereas if the second option was correct, then nothing can truly come to be after all, nothing can emerge from nothing. Parmenides concluded that given that the existence of being is readily self evident and the absurdity of arguing for creation ex nihilo, change and multiplicity must be an illusion, or our deceitful senses veiling things as they truly are. Zeno then continued this and argued in his famous Paradoxes of Motion that because moving to a point necessitates reaching the halfway point, and reaching that halfway point requires reaching a halfway point between the original position and the original halfway point, and reaching that secondary halfway point requires reaching a tertiary halfway point, which itself is subject to the same paradox. Thus, reaching the original endpoint is impossible, as it entails dividing space infinitely, which we know is an impossibility. Aristotle argued that the error of Parmenides laid in his failure to distinguish between per se truths and per accidens truths in regards to being, but focused on the question of motion that had made Zeno an infidel to the possibility of walking from the kitchen to the living room. Aristotle thus proposes a third option to the dilemma of Parmenides, based on the ideas espoused by Plato, that 3. Potential being becomes actual being rather than being coming out of being or non-being. Aristotle's arguments in the context of his discussion on physics are important for explaining his conception of motion as an incomplete actualization that is only fully actualized when the object comes to rest. For example, a book that is dropped has the potency to fall until it hits the floor. It was not the case that the book was always on the floor and merely appeared to move through deceptive sense data, nor was it the case that the book suddenly materialized from non-being on the floor. Rather, as Aristotle explained, it went from having the potential to fall and to having fully fallen. Likewise, when it comes to the concept of being itself, it was not the case that being originated in non-being. Rather, actual being came from a potential non-actualized being. As Aristotle pointed out, it is a mistake to think that change would have to involve something coming from nothing. Go back to the coffee. It is true that while the coffee is hot, the coldness is not actually present. Still, it is there potentially in a way other qualities are not. That it has the potential to become cold while lacking certain other potentials shows that the coldness is not exactly nothing, even if it is not yet actual either. The coffee has the potential to become cold, and after sitting out for a while, that potential is made actual. This is not a case of something coming from nothing, which Aristotle agrees is impossible, because again, a potential is not nothing. What change involves then is for Aristotle the actualization of a potential. So, change occurs and it requires a changer. Change requires a changer because it is the actualization of a potential, and the actualization of a potential can only be explained by something actual. Now, notice then, often what is true of the thing being changed is also true of the thing changing it. The coolness of the air in the room makes the coffee cold, but the coolness of the air was itself merely potential until the air conditioner actualized it. The flick of your wrist causes the fly swatter to come down hard, and its impact in turn kills the fly. But the flick of your wrist was itself merely potential until the firing of certain motor neurons actualized it. So, when something causes a change, that is sometimes because it is undergoing a change itself. And when that is the case, that change too requires a changer. So, when a potential in a thing is being actualized, sometimes the actualizer is undergoing change itself. That is, it is being actualized, in which case the change occurring in the actualizer itself requires a changer in order to count for it. Now, we often explain changes in terms of prior changes. The room gets cold because you switched on the air conditioner earlier, which happened because you felt hot, which was caused by heat reaching you from the sun, and so on. This is a linear series, also known as an accidentally ordered series. A linear series of changes extending back in time might have no first member, as the past might be infinite in duration. But on the other hand, an essentially ordered hierarchical series, which need not go back in time, although sometimes they may, are fundamentally different from linear series in that the later members of the chain have no power to act, except insofar as they derive that power from prior members. In a hierarchical series, each member is thus being actualized by prior members and is only capable of acting insofar as it is being actualized by those members. In other words, every member of a hierarchical series, apart from the first, has its power only in a derivative way. Thus, in a hierarchical series of events, in a hierarchical series of causes, the later members of the series are instruments. In a linear series, on the other hand, the members of the series have their own causal power and can continue acting even if prior members cease to exist or operate. Now, it is because of this difference that a hierarchical series of causes has to have a first member while a linear series does not. Here, first does not mean temporarily first, but rather something whose power to act does not derive from anything else. Something which is not the instrument of anything else, which has its causal power in a primary or built in way, and which can impart causal power without anything being imparted to it. Hierarchical series are more fundamental to reality than linear series, because a linear series of causes presuppose the existence of an underlying hierarchical series. Things can undergo change only because they exist, but for any material thing we can legitimately ask what makes it continue to exist. Appeals to past causes in a linear series fail to explain anything, because although they explain why the thing came to exist, they do not explain why it continues to exist. To say that the things exist by default because nothing has come along to break up or destroy that thing yet still doesn't explain what keeps it in existence at any moment. After all, it has the potential to either exist or not to exist. Appeals to the structural arrangement of the internal components don't work either, as they fail to explain why those components are not arranged differently. Hence, the chain of explanation for things' existence must be a hierarchical chain. What it means for such a series to have a first member is that there is something which can impart causal power to the other members of the series without having to have that power imparted to it. Something that has its causal power in a built in or a non derivative way. Now, since what is being explained in this case is the actualization of a thing's potential for existence, the sort of first cause we are talking about is one which can actualize the potential for other things to exist without having to have its own existence actualized by anything. What this entails is that this cause doesn't have any potential for existence that needs to be actualized in the first place. It just is actual, always, and already actual, as it were. Indeed, you might say that it doesn't merely have actuality the way things it actualizes do, but that it is just pure actuality itself. It doesn't merely happen not to have a cause of its own, but could not, in principle, have had or needed one. For being devoid of potentiality, there is nothing in it that could have needed any actualizing, the way other things do. It is in this sense that it is an uncaused cause, or to use Aristotle's famous expression, an unmoved mover. More precisely, we might call it an unactualized actualizer. Now, this first cause is the ultimate cause of the existence of things. It keeps them in existence at any moment at which they exist at all. First of all, since the cause of things is pure actuality and therefore devoid of potentiality, it cannot go from potentiality to actuality and is thus immutable or unchanging. Since existing within time entails changeability, an immutable cause must also be eternal in the sense of existing outside of time altogether. It neither comes to be nor passes away but simply is, timelessly, without beginning or end. Since to be material entails being changeable and existing within time, an immutable and eternal cause must be material and thus incorporeal or without any sort of body. Consider further that a thing is good to the extent that it realizes the potentials inherent in it as the kind of thing it is, and bad to the extent that it fails to realize them. A good painter, for example, is good to the extent that he has realized his potential for mastery of the various aspects of painting, craftsmanship, composition, and so forth, while a bad painter is bad to the extent that he has failed to acquire the relevant skills. But a purely actual cause of the world, devoid as it is of potentiality, cannot be said to be bad or deficient in any way, but on the contrary, to be perfect. In that sense, such a cause must be fully good. Summarizing, a defect in a thing is a privation, a failure to realize a potential that is built into the nature of that thing. Hence, the first cause, being purely actual, cannot be defective. Something is perfect to the extent that its potentials are actualized. Hence, a purely actual cause must possess maximum perfection. Now, could there be more than one such cause? There could not even in principle, for there can be two or more of a kind only if there is something to differentiate them, something then one instance has that the other lacks. And there can be no such differentiating feature where something purely actual is concerned. Thus, we typically distinguish the things of our experience by the material or temporal features, by one thing being larger or smaller than another, say, or taller or shorter than another, or existing at a time before or after another. But since what is purely actual is immaterial and eternal, one purely actual thing could not be differentiated from another in terms of such features. More generally, two or more things of a kind are to be differentiated in terms of such some perfection or privation that one has and the other lacks. We might say, for instance, that this tree's roots are more sturdy than that one's, or that the squirrel is lacking its tail while the other has its tail. But as we have seen, what is purely actual is completely devoid of any privation and is maximal in perfection. Hence, there can be no way in principle to differentiate one purely actual cause from another in terms of their respective perfections or privations. But then such a cause possesses the attribute of unity. That is to say, there cannot be, even in principle, more than one purely actual cause. Hence, it is the same one unactualized actualizer to which all things owe their existence. Now, is the first cause all powerful? Since the cause of the existence of things is pure actuality itself, rather than being just one actuality among others, that which is the source of the power everything else has all possible power. It is, in short, omnipotent. The first cause must also be perfectly good, as it realizes its potentials to the fullest possible extent. A purely actual cause of the world cannot be said to be bad in any way, as it lacks nothing and is perfect. Further, what exists in the things that the purely actual cause is the cause of pre-exists in that cause in which something like the way the things we make pre-exist as ideas or plans in our minds before we make them. These things thereby exist in that purely actual cause, eminently and virtually, even if not formally. For the cause of things is not itself a cat or a tree, and cannot be, given that it is immaterial, but it can cause a cat or a tree or anything else that might exist. But it is not merely intelligence that we can therefore attribute to the cause of things. Consider that as the intelligent cause of everything that exists or could exist, there is nothing that exists or could exist that is not in the range of this cause's thoughts. It is in that sense all knowing or omniscient. This is Aristotle's argument for the existence of God. Now, even if a given series of changes has no beginning in time, even if the universe or series of universes extends forever into the past, that would be irrelevant to the argument. For the argument is rather that for things to exist here and now, and at any moment at which they exist, they must here and now be sustained in existence by God. This argument does not rest in the first place on the premise that everything has a cause. What it says is that any change requires a cause. More precisely, it says that whatever goes from potential to actual has a cause. That is very different from saying that everything whatsoever has a cause. Secondly, the argument is by no means arbitrary in claiming that God does not have a cause of his own. For the reason other things require a cause is precisely because they have potentialities that need to be actualized. By contrast, what is purely actual has no potentialities, and so there is nothing in it that needs to be, or indeed could be, actualized. Naturally, then, it is the one thing that need not have, and indeed could not have, a cause of its own.